One of the great privileges of being a pastor is you get to do weddings and sometimes wedding renewals. And sometimes people actually renew their vows after like 50 years. And anytime I get someone who's renewing their vows after 50 years, I'm like, okay, what's the secret? I'm taking notes. And one guy from Texas with a little bit of a accent says, oh yeah, I got the secret for you. And I'm like, oh, I'm all ears. He goes, you just bite your tongue. I'm like, that's how you made it 50 years? Oh yeah, you just bite your tongue. And I'm like, okay. Then he added, till it bleeds. And I'm like, well, that's some good advice, because there's something about silence being golden when it has to do with you revealing evil inside you. In other words, you could just picture a married couple having a little bit of a tiff, right? And you just want to say something mean or cruel or hurtful or demoralizing, or you want to swear or curse or gossip, and I think his wisdom is really good there. When it comes to revealing your own evil, like, just bite your tongue. Your tongue can be so evil. But today's topic's a little different. Silence isn't golden when it has to do with what about evil around you? Should you just bite your tongue? Or do we have some duty or some obligation as citizens of the kingdom when we see someone getting robbed or someone being violated, or we're aware of some evil or something nefarious going on? Can we be an ostrich and put our head in the sand, cover our ears, la la la, cover our eyes? Or do we have some duty to say something as citizens of the kingdom? And today's topic is really kind of wrestling with that. Today is saying, really, according to Numbers 30, which we'll look at, and Esther 4, maybe a couple other passages, silence is not golden, it is black. It's dark, it's deceptive, it's destructive. In fact, in the face of evil, silence is collusion. Silence is cowardice. Silence is consent. It's consent. There are turning points in people's lives, and we are living in a time where, quite frankly, to be silent in today's day and age is tacit consent. You and I both know, as believers, we've had many decades together, journeying in this great land of the free and home of the brave, but things have changed quite a bit lately, and there is a little bit of angst amongst us. Do we need to say something personally? Do we need to say something at work? Do we need to say something from the pulpit? And today, I hope these passages kind of help clarify, what are we to do? Because the opportunity to do good, to benefit our families, our congregations, our nation is here, but it has to be seized. The moment is here. It'll soon pass. It is brief. We live for a unique time. And the question is, what is our duty during this time that we live in? Let's read our passages for today, and then, of course, as we do historically, we'll go back and we'll unpack them a little bit and see if we can make them a little clearer. Starting in Numbers 30, 1 through 5, this passage seems to imply it's a wedding passage. It has to do with a daughter wanting to make a vow, and the father hearing about it. Of course, a young girl would be under the authority of her father while she lives in his house. What if the father says nothing? He hears about a vow or a pledge, and he says nothing. That's Numbers 30. We'll look at the first 5 verses. We'll also look at Esther 4. And in Esther 4, of course, that's the whole story of Esther and how she really makes a plea to King Xerxes in the midst of a cruel plot, a genocidal plot, to take out the Jewish people. And that, again, is another passage of, what if, her whole life could be on the line if she says something? Does she have any duty to say anything? So both of these passages have to do with, here we have a family and a father who doesn't say anything. and we have a queen or a person in a position or influence. What if she doesn't say anything? We'll have a man, we'll have a woman, we'll have a couple scenarios. Numbers 30, starting in verse 1. Moses said to the heads of the tribes of Israel, "This is what the Lord commands. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything that he said. When a young woman still living in her father's household makes a vow to the Lord or obligates herself by a pledge, and her father hears about her vow or pledge, but says nothing to her, remains silent, then all her vows and every pledge by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her father forbids her when he hears about it, none of her vows or the pledges by which she obligates herself will stand. The Lord will release her because her father has forbidden it." So Numbers, we have a scenario with a father that says nothing. What does that do to a young woman's vow or a child's vow or someone under authority's vow? Let's go to Esther. Esther chapter 4. I think I'll just, there's lots of great verses here, but because of time, I'll just read verse 14, where Mordecai is saying to Esther, given this genocidal scenario that's happening, if you remain silent at this time, in the moment of crisis, when you're aware of something evil going on, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. In other words, God will use someone else. But you and your family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. We'll unpack that a little bit too, but it reminds us of really us Californians who are in a provocative state with a kind of a cuckoo governor and a lot of liberal, crazy, progressive, wacko stuff going on. But who's to say that God doesn't have you here for a reason, for this providential purpose, for this time in history, to actually be a part of representing the kingdom and God's solution? Anyways, let's unpack. Let's go back to Numbers 30. So here we have this scenario of a wedding ceremony. Here we have the issue at hand, which is if a young person under the authority of her father, not living on her own, probably a virgin, unmarried, probably about age 12 or 13 in the Old Testament, makes a vow, and her husband, or in this case her father, hears about it, but he doesn't say anything, does that do anything? Well, yes, Numbers says it does do that. And by the way, at any wedding, anyone who attends a wedding, that is a wedding sanctioned by God, a wedding that is a sacred event, who chooses not to say anything, they too are accountable. In the old days, it doesn't happen too often, but I do typically ask people when I'm officiating a wedding, do you want me to do the old statement that a pastor would make, that is, if anyone here should have cause or reason that these two should not get married, say it now or forever hold your peace. Most moderners say, no, don't say that. we don't want that part in the wedding. I like that part in a wedding for lots of different reasons, but it reminds those that are attending that by their presence, if they don't say anything, they are now obligated to the vow themselves and will be held accountable. They'll have some guilt and consequence if this couple does not fulfill their vow. So there was like a gravitas to, what the heck? You know, it's like, yeah, you're not just guests here eating the food, you're witnesses. The other thing, it was to protect the couple. And I have done some reading sometimes, you know, I like history. In the old Western days, people did speak up. And they said crazy stuff. She's a whore, you know, he's a nine. It's like, thank you for the feedback. Really great. Okay, what else? she went with his mother, and he's it's like, thank you, anything else? Like, the point was, if you had something, go ahead, get it out, but as soon as they do the vow, you're done. Once they're married, you have no right before God to say anything negative about the couple, because you had your opportunity. So if you don't think they should get married, or she had sex with his mama, and it's like, whatever. Okay, bring it all out, and it's been heard, it's been duly noted. Now you're done before God. You don't have the freedom afterwards, like while eating cake after the vows, going, I don't think their marriage is going to work. They never should have done this. It's like, you already had your opportunity. Now they need your full support. This Old Testament passage is exactly about that. If you don't say something, are there consequences? And here's what Moses says. Moses said to the heads of the tribe, verse 1, that is the chief leaders of God's people. They would meet occasionally. They had judicial capacity. They were the leaders. He wants to make sure the whole nation understands this truth. And by the way, this is going to mention a vow of men, which I do think includes boys. And then he's going to say, but what if it's an underage like woman who's under authority? It doesn't really issue anything for young men. I do think if young men make a vow, it stands in the patriarchal society. But this is what the Lord commands, verse 2. When a man, note the sex is male, the age is grown up. So this is when a grown-up adult male makes a solemn vow, could be translated a promise, something lawful, to the Lord in honor and service to the Lord, or if he takes an oath or swears an oath or obligates himself by a binding pledge or promise to do something, he must not break or profane his word. If a grown man gives you his word, he needs to do it. Now, it says an oath or a pledge, a vow or an obligation. A vow was kind of like a positive thing that I will do such and such. An obligation was usually typically like a negative thing, like I want to give up something. There were times that they would make a vow to, like, God, if you save me, I'll do this for you, right? You better do it if you say that. And there's some obligations where, like, I will give up food or abstinence from sex, or if I was a Nazirite, I won't cut my hair, or some obligation that you will not do, or a prohibition, if you will, an abstinence. I won't drink wine anymore. I'll be done with alcohol. So whether you make a positive vow or a negative one, something you tell God you're going to do or something you're going to get rid of, you better do it. He must do everything he said. This means he must act exactly in accordance with everything that comes out of his mouth, punctually, conscientiously. So a vow should be performed in the manner, the time, and the kind with which it's first proposed. A vow, by the way, is not something you think in your head. It's not like an imagination, like, I probably should do this, but you haven't verbalized it to anyone. That's not a vow. A vow is verbalized in public with witnesses, and it obligates you. Sometimes in a wedding ceremony, I'll mention Ecclesiastes 5, which basically I think we did in your wedding, which is a reminder. Before you take this vow, Solomon says it's better to not vow than to make a vow and not keep it. So if you're going to do this, let's do this. And for everyone who's present, let's support them to do it, because we'll need it. But now, in verse 3, he says, what about a woman who's under authority? Like, she's underage, and she's under the tutelage, or the roof, or the covering of, in this case, her father. What will happen? And if you know a little bit about the ancient law, the father, the patriarch, had usually like a 24 to 48 hour period. He could annul a vow by someone under his authority that he didn't want to agree with. So he could affirm, approve, sanction, and support the vow. And that would happen, by the way, if he said nothing. Or he could forbid, prevent, if you might say, veto, or interdict the vow because he's the patriarch. Once you move out of your home and you have your own adulthood, you get to make your own rules, right? I say that to my own kids. But in my castle, this is how it works here, right? I have authority here. I don't have a lot of authority, but in our little space, I rule. And I don't wear a crown or anything, but I should sometimes because they forget, right? I should walk around with a scepter and So verse 3 says, so when a young woman, or in this case a daughter, still living in her father's house, again, probably a virgin, unmarried, probably 12 or 13 years old, under the care, power, and government of her dad, makes a vow or promise to the Lord or obligates herself by a pledge, and her father hears the vow, the promise, the pledge, the obligation, which he has, of course, the power to ratify or disannul. But he says nothing to her. In other words, this is about silence. He's silent. He offers no objection. Then all her vows and every pledge by which she obligated herself will stand. It'll remain valid, in force, established, and confirmed. So, what do we learn from Numbers 30? Very simply, silence is interpreted as assent, agreement, and approval. Silence is concession, compliance, and consent. If the dad says nothing, then he is giving permission, blessing, and sanction. This is very important for our culture today because there's a lot of cuckoo going on. And if you were in Germany in 1941 and you saw Jews being taken away by the Nazis, do you have a duty to say something, or I don't want to get hurt, it's too dangerous, I don't want to oppose the state? This seems to say your silence is consent. Now, this isn't just biblical stuff, though it is in the Bible here. The rule of tacit admission is part of our legal system as well, which means that admission reasonably inferred from a party's failure to act or speak. So in trial law, it's called a tacit criminal admission. It's in our U.S. Constitution, too, by the way, just for you American history buffs. Article 1, Section 7 says this: every bill which shall have passed shall be presented to the President. If any bill shall not be returned by the President within 10 days after it shall have been presented to him, the same shall be a law in like manner as if he had signed it. In other words, the President's silence is legally interpreted as his consent in like manner as if he had signed it. His silence is a signature. And of course, a lot of presidents want to show their disapproval for a bill by simply leaving it for 10 days, and then it automatically becomes law, and they don't have to say they validated it, but they just let it pass, because their silence is consent. So we have this not only in the Bible, we have it legally, we have it in our Constitution, we have it with church members at a wedding, and I don't think it's just a wedding. Church members are obligated not only to validate other people's weddings, but to validate any behavior, right? If you see something clearly going wrong, do you have a duty? And I think we do have some duty. Of course, for the pro-life movement, this has grave implications too. If, as one writer said, if babies are being killed in a community and church members know about it and are silent, they are giving their consent to killing babies. It's like, I don't want to make a big deal. I don't want to be controversial. I don't want to be too political. It's like, yeah, but your silence does mean something when a genocide is going on in your neighborhood. It's like, so challenging. Consent to sin means you are an accessory to sin and, I believe, vulnerable to judgment. What is an accessory? Well, here's what the law says, basically. Someone who had knowledge of a crime and did not attempt to prevent it. Or, after the fact, when they learn who committed the crime, they did not make it known. So your neighbor kills someone, maybe you didn't see it, but then you become aware that that's what happened, and you decide not to say anything. You become an accessory to the crime. So this is not an easy book, this Bible. This is really challenging. Let me give you another passage in Leviticus 5:1. I'm just going to throw this freebie in for you. I didn't forecast it, but it says, if anyone sins because they do not speak up, in other words, they fail to step up, they remain silent. When they hear a public charge or solemn order to testify as a witness in a court proceeding regarding something, maybe criminal, some wrongdoing, something they have seen or learned about, they will be held responsible. Leviticus 5:1. If you are asked to go to court or to testify, or you become aware of something that you learned or see or observed, and you don't say anything, you're responsible. Leviticus 5:1. It's tough being a Christian. It's really challenging. Wow. So silence imputes guilt. If we conceal a crime, it aids and abets and cuts us off from the righteous hand of God. And if we pretend ignorance and fail to take action, the scriptures say that we are conniving. We are conniving, which is we know something, but we're not doing something about it. Let me give you a New Testament example before we get to Esther. Acts 22:20. This is the Apostle Paul, who prior to being Paul, what was his name? Saul. And was he a good guy or a bad guy? Yeah, he was a bad guy. And you might remember that Stephen is the first martyr of the church, the first one that was stoned and killed for his faith. And Saul is there. Saul is present. Saul actually holds the coats of the people that do the stoning. And in Acts 20, he kind of shares a little bit about his life prior to coming to Christ, prior to his Damascus Road experience. Prior to him being converted, he's like, I was murderous. And he says this in Acts 22:20. And again, this is Saul, now Paul, who threw no stones, who said no words. He was silent. But he said, when the blood of your witness martyr Stephen was being shed, when he was being murdered, stoned to death, I stood right there nearby, silently giving my approval and consent to his death, and guarding the clothes, actually holding and watching over the cloaks and the coats of those who were killing him. So Saul, now Paul, seems to acknowledge in the book of Acts that I know what it's like to be guilty of silence. I watched Stephen murdered. I didn't say a word. I didn't do it. I didn't touch a stone. But I know that my presence and silence was an admission of my consent to what was going on. I aided and abetted, and therefore was guilty. Let's look at Esther 4. Esther 4 is just our final example today of being challenged to say something. We've looked at a few with some men. This is now a woman. And it reminds us that silence is very costly. We're called to be active and engaged in our work and contribution, in our human agency, in our opportunity. The story of Esther, briefly, is this is such an exciting, curious book. This is a great book if you haven't read Esther in a long time. But it happens about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. So the people of God are disobedient, super rebellious. God allows the Babylonians to take them captive, and now they're kind of prisoners of the state. But then some of the Jews are actually released about 70 years later. They're able to go back to Jerusalem. Nehemiah goes back and builds the wall. Ezra goes back and kind of is established. But some of them stayed in Persia. And this Esther stayed in Persia. A lot of Jews stayed in Persia, in the capital city of Susa, which was the capital of Persia at the time. King Xerxes, if you know your history, was kind of the king of the day. And in this story, basically, we have Mordecai and Esther, who are both Jews, but living in Susa, and we have King Xerxes, and then we have the villain, Ursula. No, not Ursula. Scar. No, not Scar. Haman. Haman is the bad guy. He's an Agagite, which is a key word that he's from Canaanite background, so he has hostilities towards the Jewish people that goes back hundreds of years. And he is super furious. He's got a key position in Xerxes' royal lineage in his court. And Mordecai won't bow to him when he comes by, and he's furious, and he knows that Mordecai's a Jew. So somehow he concocts this plan to tell Xerxes, the Jews are a threat to your kingdom. We need to annihilate them. We need to kill them all. And somehow Xerxes is kind of a drunken fool, by the way. He has a lot of parties, a lot of banquets, a lot of drinking, a lot of cuckoo, and he just concedes to it. So now the king of Persia has a genocidal plan like Hitler did with the final solution to eliminate all the Jews. Well, in the opening chapters of the book of Esther, King Xerxes is holding a few banquets. And at the end of one of his banquets, they go on for days and days and days, just to pomp and circumstance to validate his awesomeness. He wants his queen, Queen Vashti, to show up. She's super beautiful, and he basically wants to show her off like a trophy wife. And she refuses. She's like, I ain't doing that. One, you're drunk, you're cuckoo, you're crazy, I'm not coming. He's like, then I'm done with you. So he apparently has an anger problem. We won't get into that today, but he needs a little counseling. But so he deposes Vashti and decides, I'm going to get another queen, decides to have a beauty contest with hundreds of women, and to make a long story short, Esther wins the contest. She's so beautiful. He's captured and captivated by her. He has no idea she's a Jew. She does not reveal that because it's such an anti-Semitic environment. Even today, they hate Jews. So, Persia isn't the capital of Jew-friendly, but he picks her. So anyways, make a long story short, the king has now made an edict, thanks to Haman, to kill all the Jews. And Mordecai says to Esther, right, maybe in these interesting circumstances that God's put you in his kingdom and now you're the queen even though he barely knows you, and you're a Jew and he has no idea, maybe he's put you here for this reason. Maybe this is an opportunity not to be silent, but to say something. But if you do say something, it could cost you, of course, because one, being a Jew was not favorable, and two, you can't approach the king unless you're invited. So if you go into the king's quarters and you choose to approach them, the law said you could be put to death immediately. There's no questions. And you're a woman. No, that's not going to go over very well. So this is the story of Esther in kind of a short little brief scenario. Just a side note, one of the interesting things about Esther is God is not mentioned in the book anywhere. This is one of the few books where he's not directly mentioned. The author and writer of Esther wants you to find God because there's all these crazy things that happen, and it's so cool. I think it's a great kind of device. There's these odd coincidences, ironic reversals, uncanny timings of hearing things and who's in the right place. And what you're supposed to do from Esther is go, there has to be a God. This is so providential. This is so aligned. This is so, and of course there is. In other words, he's not mentioned, but he's everywhere in the book of Esther. So anyways, I only chose one verse for you today because the point wasn't to teach the story of Esther, but to reaffirm the gravitas of silence. And here's our verse, Esther 4:14. Mordecai says to Esther, given all that's going on, given that a genocidal edict has been ruled from Xerxes, and you just happen to become the new queen in town, if you remain silent at this time, if you keep quiet, if you hold your peace altogether in this critical crisis, in this moment of DEI, BLM, CRT, vaccination, if in the moment where the crisis is occurring, you actually zip it, Mordecai, a good Jew, says, look, relief and deliverance, in other words, liberation, help, and rescue for the Jews, it'll arise from another place. God's not going to be thwarted. If you are silent, God is not doomed. Like, you're not the only person he can use. If you don't want to say anything about the globalists today, you don't want to risk saying something about the New World Order, you don't want to put your job on the line or something, that's fine. God will use someone else. Mordecai's not an atheist. He's not like a godless person. He's like, I know God. He will keep his promise. He's not going to allow the Jews to be annihilated. He never has. He never will. But your passivity, your neglect, in this case, your silence, you and your father's family, that's all your relatives, you'll perish. You'll be wiped out. You'll be destroyed. You're going to die. In other words, Mordecai says, one, if you don't do anything, he's already going to wipe out the Jews, and you don't think he's going to figure out that you're a Jew? You're gone. If you do say something, he may kill you just for entering his palace. Like, you have no right to enter as a woman and say something to the king without an invitation. So you might be killed anyways. Choose how you want to die. Choose what you want to stand for. Choose, like, what you want to live for. And he ends the verse with this. And who knows, perhaps, but that you have come to your royal position, in other words, made king in the kingdom's palace, for such a time, such a season, such a crisis moment as this. What do you think? It's a coincidence, Esther? That somehow, through his anger problem, he deposes Vashti. Through all the hundreds of women he could have chosen, he just happened to choose you. Just at the time when there was a decision to, like, kill all the Jews in all your people, and you just happened to have access, which could cost you your life, but no one else even has access. Maybe you're living in California for such a time as this. Maybe God has you here because he knew that there would need to be some nationalists in the midst of some globalists. There would need to be some conservatives in the midst of some craziness. There would need to be some Bible-believing people in the midst of a school system and a woke system and an academic system where God is thrown out. Maybe you're here for a reason. Maybe you're providentially placed here at this time with your heritage, your background, your Christian understanding to play a pivotal role in the kingdom of God. But don't worry, if you move to Texas or Idaho, it's okay. We love you. Like, you can go. Like, we're fine with that. It's not like morally wrong. God may have another purpose we're not aware of. He can use you anywhere. But he may have you, like, certainly don't throw out the possibility that he may have you here in Cuckoo Land for a reason. And the reason isn't because your real estate investments are going to be so great, or because, like, the taxes are going down, or like there's, like, monetary benefit to you, but because there's spiritual benefit for you to take a stand, to make a difference, to encourage others, to maybe even save the republic. Californians did save the House in our government in this last election because they stood up. We'll see what the future holds. Now, my hope, as you know, is not in red or blue. It's not in Biden or Trump or Kamala or whoever. Our hope is in God. And this is a reminder, Esther, David, that maybe you're here for a reason. And silence won't befit you. W.M. Taylor, he's an old scholar, says, "Let us learn from the appeal of Mordecai to Esther that opportunity is the test of character." Who knows if you're not here for such a time as this? It was the tidal time of her life, the great opportunity for her existence. And the question is whether she would rise to the occasion and make it subservient to her greatness, or whether it would sweep her away with it as weak, irresolute, and unequal to the emergency. Happily, she stood the test, and by her courageous self-devotion proved that she was worthy of the affection with which her foster father, Mordecai, regarded her. Character is revealed only by being tested. And we're being tested right now. And our silence can be a failure in the midst of that test. W.M. Taylor goes on to say, what we shall do in a crisis depends on what we've been doing all along in the ordinary routine of our lives when no such emergency was on us. We cannot cut ourselves off from the past. There is continuity in our lives, such that the habits which we have formed in the days that are gone do largely condition us for our resources in the present. So he says, like, well, how will you know how you'll respond in a crisis? I pretty much, with the friends that I journey with, I pretty much know how they'll respond because there's been ample opportunity. I've told you stories, my NC2A stories and vaccination and different things. I've already seen people show their colors. I'm not saying whether they got vaxxed or didn't vax, but how they handled it. Whether they're a freedom-loving person that affirms other people's choices or whether they're a tyrant. They've already shown their colors. Every day we live, we are either adding to that constant element in us which constitutes our truest selves, and so increasingly that reserve force on which in times of emergency we can draw with advantage, or we are expending with imprudent prodigy our spiritual capital and living morally beyond our means so that when a crisis comes we cannot stand it and must inevitably go down. That's a lot of fancy old language of just saying, your daily habits today tell us what you're going to do in a crisis, because you're either building that reserve and that spiritual capital, that fiber, that moral fiber in you, or you're diminishing yourself so that when crisis comes, you'll be anemic and unable to respond even if you wanted to. I think there's truth to that. Well, what are the takeaways for today? I don't know. I had so many things that showed up for me, but here's a couple things. One, God gives us our position that we may use it for the cause of spreading the gospel. So your family, your education, living in this city, in this state, in this country, at this time, like all of that's providential. So ask God, why do you have me here? Because I know there's a reason. You're not here accidentally. He's given you some authority, some power, some expertise. He may have given you a business or a family. And you may now feel a little bit the burden of your talents and the dreadful weight of the gifts he's given you, but he doesn't want those wasted. He's endowed you to be a part of his plan, and that your national heritage and your cultural upbringing and the language you have and your spiritual inheritance, they're all part of your calling. And I do journey with a lot of people who are like, I don't know, I just have to figure out my why, my purpose. I'm like, it's so freaking clear. What are you talking about? Well, they're probably talking about the specific, like what job I should do. But you got to get the big purpose first, and that is you're not here very long. You're not here very long, right? So while you're here, make a difference. While you're here, live for the eternal. While you're here, do something significant. I think from this passage, too, we learn that not only are we part of God's providence, but if we neglect that providence, could be harm to us. With Esther, remember, he says, look, if you don't do it, God will use someone else, but your family will be wiped out. So I don't want to draw a direct correlation, but there is a sense if we don't do what we're called to do, that can't be good for us. And finally, I just wrote for myself, even if we're unfaithful, God's not going to be thwarted. He told Esther, like, if you don't do it, God will raise someone else up. So there's no pressure. There's no arm twisting. Like, people, we got to do this. If we don't do it, no one will do it. God will not lose his remnant. And you are his remnant today. I'm so proud of you. Like, and when I meet with other pastors, particularly from larger churches, they're like, well, we got, thousands and thousands. I got 300 warriors, man. The people that love God, love his word, they show up, they're like fierce, and they live in Corinth, crazy land, California. And it's awesome. It's super awesome. I'm so proud of you. Some of you know I came to Christ in Germany when I was 17. I was studying overseas. And so I'm a little bit intrigued with German history. My dad had a lot of German in him too, so that's probably intriguing. But I look back, and when I read those World War II writings about the church and their silence in the midst of, horrendous genocide, it's sad. But not everyone was silent. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't silent. He's like, no, he was actually here, and he was in England in seminary at the time. He didn't have to go back to Germany, but he's like, I can't, God didn't make me German from that area to say nothing. He went back, and of course they killed him. But he wasn't silent, and he was faithful, and his witness still goes on. The college students in the White Rose Resistance, these were young 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are like, this is not right. They're killing our Jewish friends. Like, someone has to say something. And they made leaflets and started passing them out at the University of Munich and other places. And of course, as soon as the Gestapo found out, they arrested them and they beheaded them all. But Sophie and her brother Hans, and these are heroes of the faith, duly rewarded. They knew that silence was consent, and they're like, we don't consent to this. And as a result of, they thought really maybe their bravery would inspire others to rise up, but it never really happened. People got more and more scared and more cowardice, and they lost their whole nation, as you know. You don't have to regurgitate that part of history. We're in the precipice. It's almost like 1941 all over again in our country. Be very interesting what happens this year. But I know you have a voice. I know you're part of God's providence. We can't do much, but we can do something. And whatever position he's given you, say something. Because silence is not only cowardice and collusion, silence is consent. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Some things matter. Let's be a vocal people. Amen?